Good morning. This is what day? Wednesday, February the 16th, and you are in Instruction Full under Education, and we welcome you. And we have an interesting guest with us, Commissioner Schwinn. We thank you for joining us. So, to get started, so we'll have time with her, I will ask for the clerks to call roll.
Representatives Sapicki, Dixie, Griffey, Harris, Haston, Hicks, Manis, McKenzie, Parkinson, Reagan, Rudder, Sparks, Warner, White, Madam Vice Chair Weaver, Madam Chair Moody, Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much for that. Members, does anyone have any recognitions or acknowledgments to make before we get started? All right, seeing none, it has been our tradition to start off our committee by saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you would care to join us, welcome. Thank you so much. All right, we will go ahead and call up Commissioner Schwinn and your team. If you would like, of course, you know you have the option to sit and whichever you prefer. I'm going to take us out of session. And members, the commissioner, she has let us know she does have a hard ending. She's got to get over to the governor's office, I believe, with a meeting. So we have you for about would it be 11:45? Okay. We will have the commissioner with us. And Mr. Buffalino, I don't know if you're able to stay after or if you have to go also, but anyway, if you're still sitting there, we'll just keep going. Okay. And if you will officially introduce yourself, and we thank you again for coming. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So Penny Schwinn, Commissioner of Education. Happy to also introduce the team that's here. Go first, Charlie.
Charlie Buffalino, Assistant Commissioner of Policy and Legislative Affairs.
Sam Piercy, Deputy Commissioner Operations.
Christy Ballard, General Counsel.
Mary Ann Dursky, Director of Local Finance, Interim CFO.
Thank you all so much. And I don't know if you have an opening statement or you want me to just start opening up for questions, whatever you came prepared to do.
Yeah, so we are happy to answer any questions that you have. Also just want to take a moment and celebrate some of the work of our districts. We recently had a big celebration last week for the districts and how they are looking to spend their ESSER dollars and how that relates to student achievement. Also, of course, the big announcement related to teacher apprenticeships, and have been excited to see that leadership from our districts and educator preparation providers over the last several weeks. So just some good news around education in the state, and wanted to make sure that I highlighted the work of our hardworking districts and schools.
Yes, always. It's always good news. All right, members, we will, if anyone has a question that they would like to start off with, you will let me know. Chairman Sapicki.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for coming today. So we know there's and I know you can't be specific, so I'm going to try not to ask you any questions to steal any of the governor's thunder here. Can you, in broad strokes, explain the current way we fund a classroom versus a proposal of the macro of how we're going to go to, so we can get a working knowledge of that from your point of view?
Sure. So there are three types of education funding models used by states. The first is considered categorical funding. That's what happens with the federal government. So you think about your Title I, Title II, Title III. That means funding goes to schools, and schools and districts must spend the money exactly how it is prescribed under that title funding. IDEA is an example of that. You have to spend money on students with disabilities under IDEA. The second is called resource-based funding. There are approximately 9 states who still use resource-based funding, including Tennessee. In a resource-based funding model, what you're looking at is identifying the resources that should be funded and then creating funding to match those resources. Sometimes that can be prescriptive, meaning that you must spend money in those categories. Sometimes it is just the recommendation on how the funding comes up. When you think about things, for example, in the BEP as a resource-based funding model, we have 46 different categories under the BEP. And while there is flexibility, when you say things like we're going to increase the teacher salaries by putting more money into the instructional component of the BEP, there are still limitations within each of those buckets. A student-based funding formula is funded at the student level. So unlike the BEP, which is at a district aggregate level, so you fund the district, which then funnels money down to schools. A student-based formula identifies the exact needs of individual students based on the priorities set by the state. Those individual needs are funded at the student level, and then in aggregate is what the dollar amount that a district would get. The main difference in terms of what that can mean for students is that in a resource-based model, you work in a lot of averages. And so it doesn't necessarily identify, especially very small groups of students at schools. The other challenge that you have in a resource-based model, and I think that's why 39 states have moved to a student-based model, is you just can't report in the same way. So when you all ask questions such as, how much do you spend on this? Or what goes into that? It is really hard to identify because we have so many different buckets of spending that happen at the aggregate. A very concrete example of the difference and why so many states have moved to a student-based model is that you might say, well, how do you fund this child with a disability? Well, it depends. It depends on whether you have one child in the district or you have 10 children in the district or you have 100 children in the district. That will change how a district is funded in a resource-based. In a student-based, you give the funding attached to the student to ensure those services can happen.
Chairman Sapiki.
And being careful how to ask this question.
Sure.
In the potentiality here of what we're going to hear hopefully soon as a committee, do you believe this, do you have confidence that this new funding formula will not delete any program, policy, tests, or reporting requirement of an LEA?
Yes, I think that what we've said from the beginning is that we want to ensure that districts get at least what they were getting under the BEP and that it would enhance and accelerate the detail of the reporting in addition to more reports that would be required.
Yes, Chairman.
Will this funding formula proposal, will it change any of the standards, textbooks, or curriculum?
No, it does not. It is, a funding formula should not dictate that.
And Madam Chairman, you
Yes.
can go to someone else if somebody else has a question. You can always come back to me if you want.
Okay. Carry on.
Okay. Do you believe this will provide more time for our teachers to spend in front of our students teaching them?
So a funding formula is not a spending plan, and I think that's the difference, is it produces the resources necessary to ensure every child can be successful, or that it should be designed to do that. The flexibility in how those dollars are used will remain at the local level.
Okay. Do you believe the funding has a direct impact on instruction?
Yes.
See, I'm easy today. Do you have any, because you kind of touched on a little bit there, how will this new funding mechanism allow our teachers, I know it's a local decision, but do you have maybe an example you can give? Because one of the things I hear from the teachers is they need more time, not a longer school day, but they need to create more time in the day to be able to teach the kids. I know, I think there's a representative here who's running a bill on testing that might provide more time for our teachers to spend there. Can you give us like an example of how maybe a district could use this new funding formula to allow our teachers to spend more time teaching standards?
Sure. So I can give an example of what I've seen in other states. So if you've moved to a student-based funding formula, what that allows typically is to ensure that students who need the resources and additional supports receive the funding attached to them. As a result, because it's now at the school level, you're generating funding that can be at the school level. A school is able to say, look, I've got 20% of my students who are economically disadvantaged, or I've got 12% of students who have disabilities, whatever that might be. I can now make very different types of decisions related to the services those students get because the funding is generated by the students in the building, as opposed to a systems level where maybe a district is assigning resources. So while I can't say in any one of the 1,800 plus schools that we have exactly what will happen, the benefit of a student-based funding formula is that those dollars start out in the school in terms of where the funding is generated, and it does allow for that local flexibility to create more time. I think a specific example that we heard from our subcommittees was on RTI. So you think about the requirements in our statute around RTI and the amount of support that's necessary to run that program. And so a flexible student-based funding formula would allow for additional resources to provide more intensive services to those students who need it the most within that block. And that might mean hiring an additional instructional aide or bringing in a 2-teacher model for that block so that you can provide more personalized services to students.
Chairman, we have a list now. Do you need one more follow-up with? All right. Thank you, Chairman. All right. On our list next, we have Chair Lady Weaver.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Department of Ed gang, for being here today. I have a few questions. In light of, what we're proposing, what the governor is proposing in investing another $1 billion into education, I want to kind of look at it from a business perspective too, and to know what this investment is going to give us. So my question is, do you feel, Commissioner Schwinn, that we are better today in preparing our students for success on the inside and the outside of the classroom than we were 4 years ago? And why?
So
Or
I-
how?
Sure. So I think, and I want to answer, I think, the spirit of the question. We are still in the middle of recovering from a pandemic. And so I think the data that we are seeing now coming out of certainly of the last spring, demonstrates that we had some challenges and that there is student achievement data that is lower than what we have seen over the last several years. So part of what we expect to do and what we're seeing districts do every single day is to put in more services and supports and interventions to make sure that we can recover as quickly as possible. We did drop across grade bands and subject areas over the last year and a half as a result of disruptions related to COVID-19. That being said, when I think about the type of work that is happening in schools and districts across the state, and I've been to close to 400 schools in our state, what I have seen, noticed, and discussed with teachers and principals and community leaders and parents is that we are making very intentional progress on critical areas like literacy. I think the Literacy Success Act from a year ago was a bold, big step forward in how we think about phonics first instruction for our young people, making sure that they can read on grade level by 3rd grade. I also think that we've made really strong steps in math. There are a number of ways that we can measure that, but when you look at what's happened in a state like Tennessee versus other states and the growth that we've seen, I would say over the last 12 years, we've gone from the bottom 5, and now we are right in the middle. I think we are poised to continue to accelerate. And so I would say I feel very optimistic about what our schools and districts will do in the decade that comes after.
And thank you. So in segue from what you just shared, I'd like to know, what is our ACT score currently? How are our kids scoring on their ACT currently?
So with ACT, I think something I'm really proud of is that we are one of the only states that did not drop in participation over the last couple of years. Most states actually declined in participation. We have taken approximately a 0.5 point hit as a result of the last 2 years or so. I can get you the state averages. I will say that it varies pretty significantly district to district. So we are right below, I would say, what the college readiness indicator is.
So do you have any information, like a graph or anything that you could show on the members on this committee where we were 4 years ago on our ACT and where we are currently? Can you get that to us?
Yes, and I think we will send the link we have a PowerPoint that's actually posted on our website now, I believe, that shows our ACT projections as well as what we've done over the last 5 years. So we're happy to send you that information.
And then one more question, if I may, Chairman.
Yes, please.
when we speak of vendors, defining a vendor, are we looking at a vendor to manage the new funding formula? Or will it be managed by the Department of Education?
So it is always, in my opinion, it is always most appropriate for a funding formula to be managed by state government. So there are no plans whatsoever to have any outside organization or entity manage a funding formula.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank
ma'am.
you. Next on our list, Representative Griffey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Swin, for being here.
Yes, sir.
First off, let me start off with this question. When you were touring the various communities throughout the state, and we were in Gibson County together, and I brought up the issue that one of our major concerns is our reading and math scores, third and eighth grade, so forth. And I thought we need to focus on that. And one of the school directors challenged me on that, was saying the problem's not the kids can't read, the problem is the test. I've actually got legislation, because following that, I sought to try to get a copy of the test questions and look at them and see just how the tests were being provided to our students. And apparently, no one can get access to those test questions unless they're old questions that have been cycled out and so forth. I finally did get a copy, and thank you and your staff for getting some of that. And I have to admit, after I read some of the questions, to me, I'm a lawyer, I'm used to reading a bunch of stuff, but they weren't worded as, the phraseology was kind of difficult to follow, and then some of the questions seemed a little disjointed, and, to sort of put it in a regular vernacular, it seems like maybe some of the questions might have been generated by some PhD in education, looking at some particular issue or whatever, rather than really focusing on our third graders and then our eighth graders actually to read and comprehend and understand what's in the material. I wonder if you might just address that, please.
Sure, I'm happy to. And so there are a few steps that states go through in terms of generating their state test. And so in Tennessee, we have items that are produced. Those are considered kind of the early draft items. Those also go through a teacher review panel. So Tennessee teachers review the items and make comments on them, and that's part of our process. We also go through something called peer review. That means other states review our tests and determine whether or not they're considered valid. And that is something that we do on a regular basis as well. So there's a number of checks and balances. On top of that, we always do what's called a field test. So a field test is once it goes through all of those steps to determine that this is an item that is ready to put on an assessment, it's field tested. So it's given to students before it quote unquote counts. So a student might take a field test item, and we have a representative sample of students who take those field tests every year. In that field test item, we make sure that it has the same response or accuracy rate that we would expect to see based on student achievement. And that's how we test out the item for validity. If it passes the validity test after it's been field tests, that's the only time it can go on an assessment. So there are a number of steps that go through to make sure it's a valid and reliable item before it goes on our test. Now, that being said, I think it's always fair and good feedback when we have, different folks who are looking at items. I also think that it continues to be something that we review each and every year. I'm very grateful, and I'm very excited about the work that's been happening on the assessment team, not just in administration, which we're really proud of, but also thinking about how we create really strong assessments in terms of the content. We've done that with the summative tests, what we call the TCAP, but we also rolled out over the last 2 years a suite of formative items that a significant number of districts use. So those are free assessments, so they no longer have to purchase and get them ready for the TCAP.
Madam Chair, thank you. I appreciate that, and I would love to work with you on the legislation I feel like the legislator can do their oversight regarding the testing, and I understand there's
Sure.
The need for confidentiality. Let me shift to this question, if I may, please. I was just looking on the internet, the top ranked public schools in the U.S., and then there's Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Virginia, and Vermont, the top 5. And looking through some of the statistics, the average teacher ratio in the U.S. is 16-1, and Vermont's is 10.5-1. Virginia's got really good math and reading scores. New Jersey spends an average of $21,866 per student. Connecticut's teachers have an average annual salary of $73,000. My question this is, do you, and I know you can't let the cat out of the bag, or there may not be finalized plans on this revamp of the BEP. Do you feel that this revamp of the BEP is going to move our students up into the top 10, top 5? Are we moving closer to sort of some of the models and doing what states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont are doing? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm going to say a couple of things there. One is we would be happy to send you the documentation. There was a request by the steering committee to actually look at every single state, where they are ranked on the NAEP, which is that apples to apples assessment, and then how much they spend per student. I think it's a really good way to look and see these dollars allocated generated these outcomes for these different states. So we'll make sure to get you that spreadsheet. I think it's interesting to look at and kind of dive into. Secondly, what I would say is that there are a lot of states who perform very well, and what we've seen is there is a varying level of funding. What really matters in the formula is certainly that you have a minimum amount of funding that will generate good outcomes, and that you are able to track how that money is spent, report on that, and ensure that we're making really good strategic decisions on behalf of students. And so the biggest thing that I think is going to be important in any kind of new proposal that would come out is that we have a funding amount that allows us to accelerate achievement, and that we have the necessary components within that bill that would ensure that we have the accountability in place and the reporting and transparency in a place in the way we just don't have with the BEP. Yes, sir.
Thank you. And members, for the members that came in maybe a little late, we have the commissioner for just a few more minutes till about 11:45. So I appreciate y'all being succinct and quick so we can get our whole list. And with saying that, Representative Parkinson, and I'm not picking on you, but
Succinct.
it just worked out that way. You know I love you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's amazing how your soliloquy came right before I was
Timing.
to speak. Right. I object to all the questions you asked. I'm just kidding. Thank you, Commissioner. Always
Yes,
good
sir.
to see you and the team. Always good to see you. I do just have a couple of questions, and
Yes, sir.
and some of them, may be repetitive. I was trying to write while you were discussing some of the other things, but can you just tell me what the basic difference? I think you were saying this in the last thing that you spoke on before. Chairman Sapicki spoke, and I shouldn't have called his name because he might get called on again. But can you tell me the difference between the existing formula and this new version that we're contemplating going to?
Sure. So I'll say that the resource base, and it's the 46 different components of the BEP, and so an example might be a student ratio. So this student or this need generates an 8.5 to 1 ratio for a student with a disability based on a category. We're moving to a format that is student-based, which means you look at the individual student and you identify what those students' needs are based on state priorities. What we heard from subcommittees, just to give you a sense of what we heard, is economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty were significant areas of feedback and focus. Sparse and small were significant areas. Students with disabilities, English learners, characteristics of dyslexia, and gifted students were all some of the areas that we heard the most about in terms of what we might want to provide additional funding for. That should generate student-specific services. It also means, and I failed to say this before, but as a parent, I would be able to see how much money the state is investing in my child. And all 3 of my children might have different investments based on their varied needs. That is a level of grain size that we cannot produce under the BEP. That is a real benefit in transparency and accountability from the state's perspective.
Okay. And thank you for that. And so, Commissioner, under that scenario, you mentioned state priorities. What are the state priorities?
Well, we asked the subcommittees, and so it's the ones that I just mentioned in terms of where we would want to provide additional funding. I also think that we heard some really good feedback about things like CTE, making sure that we have programs in high school so that our high school students have access to careers before they graduate. We heard a lot related to early literacy. As you can imagine, that's been a priority in the state, making sure we can invest in our very young students so that they are reading on grade level by 3rd grade. Those bookends were things that we heard a lot about. Couple of other things that I would mention. We heard a lot about the ratios for counselors and school nurses. That was a major component of the feedback. And of course, we heard a lot about teacher salaries and compensation. One thing that I want to highlight for everybody in terms of data that's available, and we're happy to give this to you, is we look at kind of the southeast part of the United States. So we did an analysis about salaries and compensation. Tennessee ranked in terms of the average salary in the southeast, and that's SREB has a dashboard. We're right in the middle. Where we have seen the biggest challenge in terms of the feedback from subcommittees is when you talk about take-home pay. So that's the cost of insurance and benefits and retirement compared to other states. That has been one of the biggest difference between Tennessee and some of our regional peers. So we got a lot of feedback about that.
Okay, and can you give us an example? I got just two questions real quick.
Yes, sir.
One, can you give us an example of a student that will receive the least amount of funding versus a student that would receive the most amount of funding? And also, from a fiscal standpoint, will this new strategy of outlay of funding, will it reduce the budgetary outlay from the state or increase the budgetary outlay from the state?
Sure. So in terms of who gets the most or the least, it really is making sure that what we call the base. So a formula is based on a base. That means the amount that every student gets no matter where they live. Then you have weights, which are the additional funding for the different boxes you can check. And then direct funding are things like CTE or early literacy, ACT, things like that. So a student who would receive the most funding would be a student who gets the base, who checks every single component of the weights, and who might be in high school for CTE. So it's going to vary pretty
Gotcha, okay.
significantly. I will say that those communities or those schools that have high concentrations of students who are economically disadvantaged, they will likely have additional funding on top of what they already get. Very candidly, that tends to benefit our rurals and our urban communities the most. That's where we see the most Title I eligible schools.
Okay. And from a fiscal standpoint, do you anticipate that there'll be an increase of a budgetary outlay from the state or a decrease? And how does local government intersect with that?
Sure. So the governor's currently proposed in his proposed bill that would be 250 would go into the BEP this year. 125 million would be for teacher educator salaries. The rest would be for BEP ADM growth that's typical every year. There's another 750 million that he is proposing would be recurring funding. So that would be kind of the state contribution into a new formula. There are also local considerations. I think one of the most important components of rolling out any formula is making sure that all of our districts get at least what they were getting before. That's kind of a basic principle that you see when anyone rolls out a new formula in any state. That is a shared foundational principle that happens. But also that when we think about that local contribution or match, that we're ensuring that we don't have to raise taxes. That's something that I think is really important as a value statement. And so creating something that allows for more money to go into schools, more accountability for those dollars, and making sure we control those local costs so that there isn't a burden on local taxpayers. I think those are all three really important principles.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Chair Lady.
Representative Parkinson, you get a gold star. Let it be noted. Thank you. All right, Chairman Sapicki, your name was called, so to be proper.
Thank you, Representative Parkinson. Right back at you. So I'm gonna continue on here, okay? I'm gonna shift a little gears here, all right?
Yep.
I'll be quick. So we know the governor in his proposal, $1 million for CTE for our high schools, $500,000 for our middle schools. We know all of the dual enrollment courses we're putting in and access to all that. The partnerships we're getting with businesses coming into our high schools. You've seen Mount Pleasant High School. Isn't there a presumption, though, that our kids can read, write, and do math on grade level to take advantage of all those options? How are we addressing that to make sure that when we do spend all this money in our middle schools and high schools for all these different pathways, that when the children get there, they have the ability to take advantage of all those different options? What are we doing pre-exposure to all those options?
Sure. And I think a really good and important question. And the first thing that I would answer to that is the Literacy Success Act was one of, and I will say this as a compliment to all of you, that it was one of the boldest pieces of literacy legislation the country's seen in a very long time. We've seen a lot of states start to copy that and the programming that came off of it. Our districts are doing really incredible, very good work in implementing phonics-based instruction in classrooms. We're working closely with Ed Preps. So I think that policy shift was significant. We had a massive investment in early literacy, frankly, and also in tutoring through our ESSER dollars. So we had most of our ESSER funding, frankly, focused, those one-time dollars were focused on our early grades. That included Reading 360 and implementing the Tennessee Literacy Success Act. Will likely be close to $150 million. Tennessee All Core is another $200 million. So you see a real significant investment in one-time dollars there. The bookmark or other side of that is then what are we doing for high schools? And so this is a proposal that would allow for our high schools to continue to create programs that students can matriculate into. But I strongly agree with you that we want to make sure that all of our students can read on grade level by third grade and they're able to be proficient in mathematics. Both of those things are incredibly important. What I think you will see, and I think the feedback that we've received is that we need to make sure that's a priority area in any funding that goes forward. That's been feedback from the subcommittees and the steering committee, and I'm looking forward to being able to talk more about that.
Thank you. All right, next on the list is Chairman Reagan.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And again, thank you for being here.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate the work. I had the distinct honor to sit on one of those subcommittees you referenced that went on throughout the summer. There were some questions that came from that I would like to have you address in deference to my colleagues. I'm not going to ask all that I have here, but let's start off with, you mentioned that the student-based funding. I sat on the leadership subcommittee. Things that came up were the number of counselors, school resource officers, nurses, social workers, building repairs, et cetera. How do you allocate per student funding on that basis? And tied into that, which I want you to address, is you may need more counselors in one situation per student than you need in another, or more school resource officers. So how are we going to address the calculation per student?
It's a really good and important question. So there are a couple of ways that I would answer that. So first and foremost, when you're looking at what goes into a base, and that is what every student, no matter where they live, should have access to. That on the per student, let's say we take counselors and we say we want to make sure that we have a counselor allocation within the formula that matches national recommendations, which is 1 to 250. You would take the cost, so to speak, of a counselor, which is their salary, compensation, some materials they would need, desks, resources, things like that. Take that full cost of a counselor and divide that by 250 students. So every student would generate 1/250th of the cost of that counselor. And that is allocated to every student in the state. Now you think about schools that have additional needs. So schools that might need more social workers, schools that might need more school resource officers, or whatever that example is. That's why the weights are so important. The weights say, look, I'm in a school that has a high concentration of students with disabilities. And so we are really going to need additional supports for interventionists, for instructional aides, et cetera. And I am then able to fund more of those than the base because that is what the weight funds. Similarly, you might have a scenario where a group of students within a school need a higher amount of contact time with a social worker or a nurse. In those cases, the weight for, let's say, economically disadvantaged or student with disability, et cetera, they would produce more funding through the weights that would then create the funding to purchase or have allocated for more social workers. That's why the weights are so important. They are to allow the school to afford to purchase the resources that are needed to serve the students in the building.
Madam Chair, and again,
Yes.
in deference to my colleagues, I have only 2 more questions, but they're tough.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
In relation to what you just said on that, you had mentioned earlier measurement system validity and repeatability, which of course is very important. The question that ties to that and to these other things that you just mentioned is a feedback mechanism specifically tied to student outcome. That is to say, it's one thing to talk about all the money we're going to put into students, but from a taxpayer standpoint, I care what that student learns, what they graduate with a skill set for.
Yes,
So
sir.
outcome. And then if we have schools or districts that are not meeting the outcome, how do we change our funding formula? And likewise, how do we reward those schools and systems that are doing excellent work?
Yes, sir. So I feel really strongly about that. And so what I can say is that I think that you will be pleased with the bill language when it's released in the coming week. I'll be happy to talk to you about it once that's released.
All right, Charlie, you're going to get it, buddy.
All right, thank you. And on next on the list, Representative Dixie.
Thank you. we've talked a lot about this funding formula, but one thing I wanted to kind of address, I don't think I've heard it addressed so far. I think the governor's made a statement that we're going to allocate funds that will go directly to teachers. How will this money that's meant for teachers get the money? How does this formula account for that?
Sure. So appreciate that question. So I think the governor was saying, and I know you all put money aside and have traditionally put money aside every year that says we are going to put X number of dollars into the instructional component of the BEP. Sometimes that goes to teacher salaries. Other times I heard a great example from a superintendent just yesterday who said, look, because of class size ratios, we might, even though we have 60 students in a grade, because we have 20 in one school and 19 in another and 21 in another, we actually have to purchase 4 teachers. So that's why we have to hire more staff. So there's lots of local context there. That being said, what the new formula would allow is it would be able to say, similarly, you reserve a certain amount of additional funding. So let's say in the case of using the same numbers this year, $125 million. You want to make sure that that actually goes to teacher increases as opposed to instruction in general. The new bill will provide a mechanism for you all to designate that that funding must be used for teacher salaries. I don't think, I mean, it's not going to be prescriptive on how much and when and who. That still is a local decision, but it does ensure that it goes to teacher pocketbooks as opposed to any other of the allowable items that are currently provided for in the BEP.
So that, that kind of leads me to my next question is, we had talked about the BEP, and I think you just hit on it about how sometimes that outside the BEP formula, there's teachers that aren't funded through this. Will that be the case for those? Will there be teachers outside this particular formula? Will that be the case for them?
No, and I think this is going to be a really important distinction between a resource-based and a student-based. So in a resource-based formula, it generates an appropriate number of teachers, quote unquote. So it says, because you have this many students and this is the ratio, this is how many teachers the formula funds. In a student-based formula, it does not have, we aren't going to have BEP funded teachers. There are just dollars going to schools. And then we will say you have class size restrictions, just like we do now, 20 to 1 in elementary, et cetera. And it is a local decision in terms of how you want to allocate your staffing. You might need to put more teachers in an elementary school because of the population that you have or wanting to lower class sizes. You may suggest that you need, to the question earlier, more social workers or counselors, librarians. Those are all decisions that can be made at the local level. So there are no more kind of TISA funded teachers or BEP funded teachers. It is actually just teachers. And so if districts or local communities want to provide additional funding on top of a formula, they would still be allowed to do that. There would be no restriction on additional funding.
That sounds good in theory, but what happens is, let's say if every school, they need the maximum amount of teachers, there's only so much money to go around. Something has to give, and we don't have an unlimited budget for education. And so I think that it's like if every LEA put this wish list of what they had with all the students that they have that's coming in, something's not going to make it. And I just want to know that if that is the case, where are the cuts going to be made? How is it going to be funded? How is this going to how are schools, go down to the actual school level? How are they not going to be put in the position of where they have to scramble now to make decisions on who's funded, how to make sure they get to cover those kids, the teachers in these classrooms. And I think there's a little disconnect there that kind of gives me a little concern about this.
So I think I'd probably need to understand the question more. We're proposing to put in $1 billion more. So I can't imagine there would be a scenario where you would have to cut in that case. So anything that is funded now would carry over into a new formula. So this is on top of what is currently being funded in K-12 public education in Tennessee. So you would have our current BEP amount plus the additional proposal of $250 this year and $750 if the formula is proposed. And we still have districts who have maintenance of effort, which means those districts who put more on top of their required contribution, they would still have that. So I can't imagine that that would result in any kind of cuts in any way, given that is just additional funding for schools.
Thank you, Chair Lady. But one quick thing is, what
Sure.
if $1 billion isn't enough? That's really my question.
I think that is a really important question for you all to discuss with General Assembly members. I will say, as a commissioner, I am thrilled that a number that high is being proposed by Governor Lee, and I am excited to be able to ensure there is strong accountability for how those dollars are spent. But when I talk to superintendents and teachers in districts, this is a big deal for K-12 public schools. I think it would be potentially the biggest single investment in a single year. And I frankly am over the moon about the number. I did not expect that, and I'm very, very grateful for it.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Thank you,
Thank you.
Commissioner.
Chairman
Yes, sir.
Haston, you're next. Do you have a short? Okay. Representative Warner, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner and,
Yes, sir.
and Department for being here. Before we vote on this legislation, would there be maybe a spreadsheet or something put out showing what districts are receiving now under the old formula versus the new?
Yes, sir. So what you can expect is at the district level, the district will receive, here's what you would have received under the BEP. Here's what you would receive under a new formula. Here's what that means for all of your local contributions. So they will have all of that information in real time. We will do the same thing for county commissioners, and we will do the same thing for all of you for the districts within your district. So all of that information will be available as soon as the bill is released.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Do you have time for one more, or do you
Yes, ma'am.
need to go? All right. Representative Sparks, if you can be short and
Real
succinct.
quick, yeah. As you know, Rutherford County is growing, one of the fast growing
Yes, sir.
areas of the state. I know my mayor, Bill Kitchen, the chairman of the school board, Tiffany Johnson, just texted me, how are we going to try to address these fast growing counties? And another issue of mine has been more counselors, more social workers, and the late Dr. Linda Gilbert that you knew, a lot of folks knew. She passed away after our opioid town hall meeting, and she said, Mike, that's a critical area. The mental health of the 6 to 9-year-olds, it's off the chart. And I think everyone agrees. What worries me is like the chairman from Murray County mentioned last week about this reading level on the 3rd grade. And I don't want to talk about Texas and the pipeline and all that, but y'all get it. Y'all understand it. The chairman gets it, and I appreciate it. But how are we addressing, I know you hit some of that, but the fast growing counties and that funding formula for getting more of the social workers and counselors in there. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So for fast growing, that is something that we had a specific subcommittee that looked at to make sure that they were looking at it, and then certainly talked to a number of folks who this is really important. There are 2 different components or philosophies about fast growing. One is about making sure that if you have a large number of students year to year increased, that you're getting same year funding for those students. That's really important because you have the costs that year for those students. You need the funding that year. So that's one component of fast growing. I think you will continue to see that be an important part of any new legislation. The second part is around infrastructure. There's a good example where we have some districts who have to build a new building every single year. That is a different level of cost and expense. And so there is some additional infrastructure consideration, not just the per student, but the one-time costs of changing bus routes, purchasing more buses, the staff that goes with it, the portables, building a new building. Both of those are considered in terms of how we're thinking about the new formula. And then on the counselors and social workers, I do want to just say, if I can, point of privilege, thank you for continuing to bring Dr. Gilbert into the conversation. I think she is one of the most important people I've met in this job and in my career. So thank you for that. I think she would be pleased, and I hope she would be pleased in terms of the counselors and social workers, how we're thinking about those ratios in terms of increases to the base. It was one of the top 3 things that we heard across all subcommittees and continues to be a priority in terms of what is necessary for students. So thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Do you have one more for someone that hadn't asked yet?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Representative Rutter.
Good morning. Thank you for
morning.
being here.
Yes, ma'am.
This is a little off course. It's not about funding, but we push for in-person learning because we know that that's the best for our students, our struggling students. But when it comes to tutoring, are we going to require that tutoring be conducted in person or virtual?
That's a great question. So if it's Tennessee All-Core, which is the tutoring that's reflected in the bills from special session, that's in-person tutoring. We also know that some of our districts, in relation to their ESSER or federal relief funding, have also offered online or virtual tutoring. That is outside of kind of the state program, but it is something that we know some of our districts are using. In terms of high school, for high school, what we've seen in the data, especially over the last 5 years, is that online or virtual tutoring tends to be beneficial for high schoolers because they have band and sports and choir and everything after school. They are less likely to attend an after-school tutoring program, but they are likely to do some online tutoring that can happen with their peers. Rutherford County actually has a great peer-to-peer tutoring model that happens online between high schoolers in one school and another, as well as teachers who are able to do that as part of the after-school programming. But for our youngest students and for those that are in a state funded tutoring program, Tennessee All-Core, that is in person.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. There's some more that would like to ask another one, but I'm going to let you give me the cut signal when you
I'll
need
do
to
one
go.
more. I hate to leave if there are questions, so I'll one
That's
more.
okay.
So yeah.
All right. Representative, Chair Lady Weaver. Oh, did you? Okay.
I can wait too.
Okay. Well, okay, everybody said they can wait. Wait. Excuse me, Chairman Sapicki.
You may not know your schedule.
Mhm.
I think in our subcommittee, we don't have many bills coming forward next week, like a couple. I'm sure this is a pretty good conversation we're having right now.
Mhm.
Could you check your schedule and see if you could be back next week and we can continue on where we are?
I'd be happy to.
If that's
All
okay
right.
with the chairman.
That's good.
I'll
I
arrange
think-
it with your office, ma'am. And then if anyone needs additional, if there are questions that we didn't get to today, please just let me know. And I'm happy to visit your offices and answer those.
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
Full.
Charlie, we'll get back to you.
thank you.
I'm sorry.
And we do appreciate you taking the time and the busy schedule, and I'm sorry, maybe another time we'll have more questions for the rest of your staff too. I appreciate them coming. It's good to put names with faces,
They're wonderful.
and we appreciate the work you're doing
Thank you, ma'am.
and being patient with us as we come up with more questions and as more is revealed. And I appreciate your time
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very
and
much.
being with us. So thank you to each one of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, members. Yes, Chairman Spicky.
Next week, if time allows, could we have either the chairman or members of the textbook commission to come in and testify also tomorrow on some questions that might come up?
Sure.
Thank you.
Turned us off. We have a motion to adjourn. We are adjourned till next week, same time, same place. Thank you for your good questions and being within the timeline. Thank you.